Out of curiosity, how many of you might be aging yourself, just that's a warning there. How many of you have heard of the famous actress Tallulah Bankhead? Okay. She had kind of a reputation back in the day, didn't she? She was quite spicy, they say. And they said that she was well known for being spicy, a bit of a tart tongue there, and well, she was known for liking her men. And in turn, men liked her, right? And it just so happened that at a certain point in her career, her agent told her, it might do you some good to show up in church one of these Sundays. Next Sunday is Easter, why don't you go to church? And so she did, and she went to one of those large, marvelous cathedrals that was overseen by a bishop. That means that's actually what makes a cathedral a cathedral. It doesn't just mean a big church. A cathedral has to be run by a bishop. And that also means that a bishop will also have several other priests who are working with him. And of course, there she is on Easter Sunday, and it's a marvelous, grand procession, a fantastic pipe organ and orchestra, magnificent choirs singing, and the time comes for the procession down the main aisle. And wouldn't you imagine how beautiful that must have been in a cathedral, right? There are these young altar boys with the candles and the cross coming, and the bejeweled gospel being held aloft, and as it goes by, the people bow, and pretty soon come the priests, all in line succession, probably wearing marvelous robes, but beyond what a Methodist would wear, I'll tell you that much, probably made of silk and damask and all kinds of marvelous things. And at the end of the procession comes the bishop himself, swinging an incense censer back and forth, a flaming pot of sweet-smelling smoke, and he'd be pulling that back and forth with his marvelous bejeweled hat that sort of sits on his head like this. Can you just imagine it for a moment? And right there in the front row, right where Raynell Rummage is sitting today, was Tallulah Bankhead. And right as the bishop began to pass her, right as she was walking by, she grabbed him by the arm and said to him, "Your gown is divine, but your purse is on fire." I know, right? Your gown is divine, but your purse is on fire. And there is this sense in which sort of, as an outsider, she doesn't quite connect with the larger reality of what's happening. She doesn't quite get what the story is, what's happening in the story at this moment. She doesn't quite connect to the ideas that are being presented to her. The idea of Christ himself entering the room and all of his angels attending him. This idea is somewhat foreign to her. And the reality is today is Palm Sunday, and we talk about the palms, and we do it every year, but the reality is many times we are just as lost in this story as maybe Tallulah was that Easter Sunday. We've probably heard the story a lot, right? Throughout the years, you hear it every year. We have the palms and the children and all of these things, but you probably haven't connected with it in the way that will really tell you just how symbolic, just how powerful the image is. You see, in the western gate of Jerusalem, a procession has begun, a marvelous and powerful procession. And at the center of that procession that's coming in the western side of the city, the people would be shouting, "Oh, the Son of God has come among us. Oh, the Son of God has come among us." And as they entered in, the people would be waving pieces of fabric and all of these things. And this western procession, at the heart of this western procession will be the man that they are acclaiming, Pontius Pilate. Are you shocked? Are you surprised? You see, from the western gate of the city is entering Pontius Pilate and his family. This is the first day of the week of Passover. And that tended to be a day when most of the Jewish people in Jerusalem would tend to rebel against their Roman overseers. The story of Passover is, after all, a celebration of their exoneration from being the celebration of their freedom from an oppressive government, right? So it seemed to be just something in the air that stirred them up to resist what Rome was doing. So what would happen is that on the first week of the Passover festival, Pontius Pilate would hold a military parade. And he would ride into the city with his golden eagles and his marvelous standards, and with all of his soldiers walking in lockstep with their swords and their shields, and he would be showing the people, "I am the son of Rome. I am the power of the god Mars himself. And if you dare if you dare take one toe out of line, I and my military will destroy you where you stand. It was a message to the people about who was in power. And this is what's happening on the western side of the city. But there's another promise in the Gospels, in the stories of the Old Testament. There was a promise that one day the Messiah would enter the city of Jerusalem. And he would enter through the eastern gate. And when he did, he would come humble, riding on a donkey. Now this also is a symbol and a sign. You see, many times in the days of David and Solomon and all the great kings of Israel from ages past, when the time came when they knew that there was some threat against their country and against their nation, what would happen is that the king would show the people, we are ready to take care of this. And he would hold his own military procession out of the city. And he would probably be riding on his iron chariot or perhaps atop his war horse, and he would leave the city, and the people would see the king pass by with all of his regalia and all of his soldiers and things, and they would say, oh, the king is going out to protect us. We don't have to be afraid. But when the war was over, how your king returned to the city, well, it told you a lot. For instance, if he comes with his face all smudged and covered in dirt, riding atop of his war horse looking tired, you know that he has lost the battle. And that we're about to get into a siege situation, and we all better start hoarding the food and the water so that we can make it through make it through the siege, or we should surrender. But if a king came back and he had been successful, he wouldn't come back to the city riding on a war horse. Instead, he would come riding on a donkey. Now why? Well, number one, you don't take a donkey into war. Right? I mean, can you just imagine, as soon as he saw the spears, that donkey would just sit down. Nope. We're not doing this. A donkey is a beast of burden. A donkey is what you ride when you don't have to go too fast, right? And so when David would enter the city to show his people that they were at peace again, he would come into the city riding on a donkey. The time for war is over. I've done what I was supposed to do. I protected my people. And now I'm back in the city and everything is good. We're at peace with God and with our neighbors. And this would be a sign to the people that peace had returned to the city. So I want you to imagine the contrast here for just a moment. On the western side of the city, you have Pontius Pilate entering in. And he's got all of his military might and all of his soldiers and all of his Roman standards, and people are claiming him as the god Mars himself. And through the eastern gate of the city, we see Jesus riding simply on the back of a donkey. And the people of Israel know what this means. They know what Jesus is saying. They know what image Jesus is trying to employ. They're familiar with it. Now let me ask you a question. Until I told you about it just now, were you familiar with it? See, there's a whole part of the story we had missed, isn't there? Now I'm going to pause here in my sermon and just say, this is why biblical studies is so important. This is why it's important to be in a Bible study. This is why it's important to look at the commentaries and to spend time in those things, because you miss so much of the story if you don't go back to the first century and say, what would these people have thought? If you don't imagine the view from a first century perspective, you'll never fully appreciate all that Jesus is doing. Because I want you to recognize something. Jesus did this on purpose, didn't he? In fact, this is the first in a long line of conflict that Jesus is going to be entering into throughout the entire week. He knows that by entering into the city in this way, he knows that it's going to upset people. He also knows that it is in direct contrast to what Pontius Pilate is doing on the other side of the city. Pontius Pilate is declaring the people are at war, while Jesus is declaring the time of peace has finally come. The Messiah has entered through the eastern gate of the city. The time has now come for Jesus to take his place as the king. And what happens? But immediately, people start getting mad at him. You read the Pharisees and the Sadducees, what they tell him. They say, Jesus, tell your disciples to stop it. And then, some of the other Gospels, they say, tell the children to be quiet. And Jesus says, if I tell them to be quiet, then the very rocks themselves would start crying out. And this is the first conflict that we see that begins to set the religious leaders against Jesus. Now keep in mind, they weren't big fans of Jesus to begin with. But now Jesus is doing something really powerful and scary for them. You see, part of what made these Pharisees and the Sadducees so powerful was the fact that they were willing to work with the Roman government to a certain degree. In other words, by working with the Romans, they could continue to hold power over the city. They could continue to be aristocrats. They could continue to hold on to the high priesthood themselves. These could be the movers and shakers in Israel. These are the people who are known as the leaders in their communities. And they know that Jesus entering into the city in this way threatens their bottom line. If Jesus continues to harass the Romans, well, then we also will be tossed out on our ear. And so this is a moment where the conflict starts to escalate, and it's going to continue to do so all week long. Tomorrow, on Temple Monday, Jesus will clear the temple, right? And Jesus will overturn the tables of the money lenders. On Tuesday, Jesus gets into a series of theological debates with the religious leaders. And on Wednesday, we call it Spy Wednesday, Judas will betray Jesus and sell him out to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The conflict is beginning to escalate, and Jesus knows exactly what he's doing. But the sign and the symbol of what he's doing is quite powerful, isn't it? Jesus is coming to the people. Jesus is coming to the people in a way that they would recognize. Jesus is coming to us as David did. Jesus is proclaiming by his actions that he is the Messiah. There's a whole story going on in front of us. But at the heart of it, the heart of the message is this. Jesus is not entering the city as someone who goes to war, but instead, Jesus comes into the city proclaiming that peace between God and man has finally come. The God that we were at war with for all those many centuries, the God who had tried to love us and whom we had betrayed again and again, the God whom we had left behind, the God who we had sinned against a million different times, was now declaring that he was finally coming to peace with us. Jesus is proclaiming to the people, the long conflict is coming to an end. The King has entered the city, and he will set all things aright. And this is something I think that's rather powerful. I think it underlines something about God. And it's something that I want you to remember throughout Holy Week. You see, the reality is, God is actually on your side. I know it's surprising to hear. We think of God perhaps sometimes as being punishing, or God as somehow being ready to just, how did my daddy put it? Take the wood out of you. That's what he used to call it. In other words, get the whooping. You take the wood out of you. That's what he called it. And we're constantly waiting for God to do that kind of thing, to take the wood out of you, to make you feel like you're the worst thing in the whole wide world. But the reality is, when Jesus enters into the city in this way, what is he saying? No, God wants to be at peace with you. God is, in fact, on your side. God is actually fighting for you. God actually wants you to be at peace with him. And this underlying idea is truly powerful, because instead of being some sort of warmongering God, we have a God who's trying so hard and so desperately to show us how much he loves us. So as we begin our journey on Holy Week, and as we live through each day the story of Jesus, I want you to think about this one passage. It comes from the Gospel of John. And it said, "And when the time had come for Jesus to depart to be with the Father, having loved his own that were in the world, he loved them to the very end." And that's how John actually begins the passion narrative of Jesus. He explains to us everything, the entire reason Jesus is going through what he's going to go through. Because he loves us to the bitter, bitter end. Because he loves us to the bitter, bitter end. Jesus has come to declare a peace between ourselves and God. Jesus has entered into the holy city to remind us that he is on our side and he's advocating for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen.